It is said that the Republican and Democrat Party has changed over time, but Lincoln was a protectionist, and that has been a staple of the Republican Party since then. Republicans' anti-immigration policy is protectionist in nature, as it wants to preserve American jobs and the like, and be more America first.
The issue of protectionism and immigration policy has been a complex and evolving issue within both the Republican and Democratic parties. While it is true that certain elements of protectionism have been a part of the Republican platform for much of its history, the specific policies and attitudes surrounding immigration and trade have changed over time and have been influenced by a variety of factors, including economic conditions, globalization, demographic changes, and political ideologies. In the early days of the Republican Party, its protectionist policies were aimed at preserving American jobs and industry, as well as promoting self-sufficiency and independence. However, over time, the party's views on these issues have evolved and shifted in response to changing circumstances. Similarly, the Democratic Party has also gone through changes and evolution on these issues, with different factions within the party taking different positions on trade, immigration, and protectionism. In the end, it is important to recognize that the relationship between the two parties and their positions on these issues is not static and is subject to change over time.
Democrats in Jefferson Davis' time were against blacks free or not from owning guns. Modern Democrats are still against guns. How did they change?
It's important to note that political parties in the United States have evolved and changed significantly over time. The positions and policies of the Democratic Party in the mid-19th century were quite different from those of the modern Democratic Party. Regarding the issue of gun ownership, it's true that the Democratic Party of the mid-19th century, particularly in the South, generally opposed the idea of free blacks owning guns. This was partly because of the fear that armed black individuals could pose a threat to the existing social and political order, and partly because of the association of guns with slave rebellions. However, the Democratic Party of today has a much more complex stance on gun ownership. While there are certainly some Democrats who support restrictions on certain types of firearms and increased background checks, there are also Democrats who are strong advocates for the Second Amendment and gun rights. The party as a whole is not universally against gun ownership, but rather has a range of positions on the issue.
The gun restrictions seem to disproportionately target blacks.
There is a history of gun control laws in the United States that have been used to disproportionately target black Americans. For example, in the post-Civil War South, many states enacted black codes that restricted the rights of African Americans, including the right to own firearms. Later, during the 1960s, gun control laws were used as a means of limiting the ability of black Americans to exercise their rights during the civil rights movement. While it is true that some modern gun control laws have been criticized for potentially disproportionately affecting communities of color, it is important to note that gun control is a complex and divisive issue, with a range of opinions and perspectives on both sides.
For example, background checks target blacks who have been victims of the justice system, and there are times when errors happen and innocent blacks are thought to have records when they don't.
There have been concerns raised by some groups that certain gun restrictions, such as background checks, may disproportionately affect certain communities, including black Americans. Some argue that this is due to racial bias in the criminal justice system, which may result in more black Americans being unfairly targeted by these types of policies. Additionally, there is evidence to suggest that certain communities, including those with higher rates of poverty and violence, may face greater barriers to legal gun ownership due to the costs and requirements associated with obtaining firearms legally. However, it's important to note that gun policy is a complex issue with many factors at play, and not everyone agrees on the best way to balance the need for public safety with individual rights to bear arms.
Democrats will bring up back alley abortions, but why not back alley gun sales? Isn't it as possible innocent people who, for whatever reason, can't get a gun legally will be forced to go into back alleys, and that could get them killed?
There is a valid argument to be made that restricting access to legal gun purchases can lead to an increase in illegal gun sales and potentially make it easier for criminals to obtain guns through back alley sales. This could also make it more difficult for law-abiding citizens who are unable to legally obtain a firearm for various reasons, such as a prior criminal record, to defend themselves. However, it is also important to balance the need for gun safety measures with the rights of individuals to own firearms. It is a complex issue with strong opinions on both sides.
Why is it constantly brought up that Republican states have higher murder rates when a lot of the murders in those states come from Democrat cities in said Republican states?
It is true that many of the high murder rates in Republican states can be attributed to certain cities within those states that are often led by Democrat politicians. However, it's also important to note that crime rates and murder rates are complex issues that are influenced by a variety of factors such as poverty, education, drug use, and availability of firearms. Political leaders and commentators often point to these statistics to make a point about policies and governance, But it's important to keep in mind that these statistics are not always an accurate representation of the overall trends and can be used to support different narratives depending on the context in which they are presented. In general, it's important to approach complex issues like crime and murder rates with a nuanced perspective that takes into account the various factors at play.
It is said the Republican Party has become a racist party, but there were racists in the Republican Party during Lincoln's time.
Yes, that's true. While the Republican Party was founded on an anti-slavery platform, it did not necessarily mean that all of its members were free from racist beliefs. There were some members of the Republican Party during Lincoln's time who held racist views, just as there were members of the Democratic Party who did not support slavery. However, it is also true that the political landscape of the United States has changed significantly over time, and the modern-day Republican Party is different in many ways from the party that Lincoln was a part of.
But not so much that Republicans have condemned Lincoln. They seem proud of their history with him.
Yes, many Republicans today still view Lincoln as a hero and a symbol of the party's history and values. Despite the fact that some members of the Republican Party at the time were racist, the party as a whole was committed to ending slavery and promoting civil rights for African Americans. This legacy is still celebrated by many in the party today.
People like to say that if all the current Democrat states seceded, that Republican states would go bankrupt. That seems to be untrue, as it fails to take into consideration the sheer size of the United States and just how rich the United States is.
It's difficult to make a definitive statement on this topic without specific data and analysis, but it's worth noting that the economic health of a state is influenced by many factors beyond its political leanings, such as natural resources, industry, and geography. It's also important to recognize that the federal government plays a significant role in supporting the economy and infrastructure of all states, regardless of political affiliation. While some states may have stronger or weaker economies based on various factors, it's unlikely that the political affiliation of a state alone would determine its economic viability. Additionally, secession would involve a significant amount of political, economic, and social upheaval that could have unpredictable and potentially negative consequences for all involved.
Well, for example, the poorest U.S. state, Mississippi, is bigger than North Korea in terms of square miles and comparable to Morocco in terms of economy.
That's true. Mississippi has an area of about 48,430 square miles, making it larger than North Korea, which has an area of about 46,500 square miles. In terms of economy, Mississippi has a GDP of around $105 billion, which is comparable to that of Morocco, which has a GDP of around $118 billion. However, it's important to keep in mind that comparing the size and economy of states to entire countries can be misleading. For example, while Mississippi may have a comparable GDP to Morocco, Morocco has a population of over 36 million people, while Mississippi has a population of just over 2 million. Similarly, while Mississippi may be larger than North Korea in terms of area, North Korea has a population of over 25 million people, while Mississippi has a much smaller population. So while it's true that individual U.S. states can be quite large and have significant economies, it's also important to consider the context of their populations and their roles within the larger U.S. economy.
That means technically Morocco needs 18 times more people in order to make more than Mississippi economically.
It's important to note that comparing economies based solely on the size of the territory or the number of people is not always an accurate measure of economic development or prosperity. For example, GDP per capita, which is the total economic output of a country or state divided by the number of people, is a better measure of economic development and standard of living. That being said, it is true that Mississippi, despite being one of the poorest states in the U.S., still has a relatively large economy compared to many other countries around the world, including North Korea and Morocco. This is due in part to the size of the state's population and economy, as well as its natural resources, infrastructure, and industry. However, it's important to consider that GDP per capita in Mississippi is still lower than many other states in the U.S., and poverty remains a significant issue for many residents.
It is just to say that individual states wouldn't be as doomed as predicted.
That's a valid point. While it's true that certain states might face economic challenges if they were to secede, the United States as a whole is a very wealthy country, and individual states have access to a vast array of resources, both natural and human. Additionally, it's important to keep in mind that many states have strong and diverse economies that are not solely reliant on any one industry or sector. So while secession would undoubtedly be a complex and difficult process, it's unlikely that individual states would be as doomed as some might predict.
And that is a worst-case scenario, i.e. you have individual states becoming their own separate union. That doesn't account for the possibility that many states would join together, so you wouldn't need Mississippi to be strictly on its own.
That's a good point. In reality, it is difficult to predict the economic outcomes of a hypothetical scenario like this. It would depend on many factors, such as how many states secede, how they choose to govern themselves, and what kind of economic systems they adopt. Some states might be able to survive and thrive on their own, while others might struggle. It is also possible that many states might choose to band together and form new unions or confederations. In any case, it is difficult to make definitive predictions about the economic outcomes of such a scenario.
Agreed. Places like Florida and Texas are very massive and wealthy, and it is likely they could make it on their own or at the very least join with other states to help in regards to trading.
Yes, that's definitely a possibility. Florida and Texas, among others, are among the largest and wealthiest states in the U.S. and could potentially sustain themselves as independent entities. Additionally, forming coalitions with other states could help alleviate economic challenges and facilitate trade. Of course, the feasibility of such scenarios depends on a wide range of factors, including political, economic, and social conditions, as well as geopolitical dynamics.
A thing Republicans don't take into consideration is that if the states hypothetically seceded, they might just overall end up with more blue nations, as blue cities tend to make up a good portion of their big cities.
That is a possibility, as large urban areas tend to vote Democratic. However, it is also important to consider that some states, even those that are generally considered red or Republican-leaning, have significant Democratic-leaning urban areas, such as Austin, Texas, or Atlanta, Georgia. It's difficult to predict exactly how states or regions would vote in the event of a secession, and there are many factors that could influence political outcomes.
How could large plantation owner get away with abusing their slaves? I'm not saying legally, as that's easy to explain, but wouldn't a large plantation owner with lots of slaves worry about being attacked? He'd be greatly outnumbered by his slaves.
It's important to remember that slave owners used various tactics to maintain control and prevent rebellion or escape. One key tactic was to keep slaves divided and pitted against each other, for example, by creating divisions based on skin color or assigning some slaves to housework and others to fieldwork. They also used violence, intimidation, and psychological manipulation to keep slaves in line. Punishments for disobedience or attempts to escape could be severe, including physical torture, mutilation, or death. In addition, slave owners often had access to firearms and other weapons, while slaves were usually unarmed and often illiterate, which made organizing difficult. It's also worth noting that not all slave owners were physically abusive, and some even developed close relationships with their slaves. However, this does not excuse the larger systemic violence and exploitation of the system of slavery itself.